I'm here with Robert Emmons, professor of psychology at the University of California, Davis, and founding editor of the Journal of Positive Psychology. We're here in New Haven today for a consultation on the theology of joy. Professor Emmons, I'm so glad to have you here with us
Thank
today.
you, Matt. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So, as we enter into these conversations, we usually find that we have to kind of start at a pretty basic level. So let's start there. As you see it, what is joy?
Yeah, that's a very fundamental question, I think a very important one. I've learned a long time ago that the more interesting and important a concept is, the more it defies easy definition and easy classification. So that may seem like a cowardly way out to say it's very hard to define what joy is, but I think joy is such that we can also recognize it when we see it. We can recognize it when we experience it, although there's no simple pat definition for it. So I think we need to acknowledge that right from the start. But we can also at the same time acknowledge various elements to joy so that we can say that, joy has these characteristics, even though it's not necessarily a pat formula or equation for what joy is. So I think the key essence behind joy is that it's about connection. It's about connection with something that is beyond ourselves, whether it's a relationship with another person, a relationship with a supernatural being. There's some connection to something which is beyond ourselves. So it has to have that element of transcendence to it. I think that's probably the critical component to understanding what joy is, as well as the more, I think, everyday belief that joy is this warm, positive feeling that you have. So it's a type of happiness, but it's a special type of happiness that occurs in connection with someone else or something else outside of ourselves.
So then joy would be, so you say joy is a type of happiness.
I think it is. I think, if we ordered all the positive and pleasant feelings together, we'd have several that are related yet distinct. So we'd have something like elation. We would have delight. We would have happiness, obviously. We would have a sense of awe. We would have gratitude. We would have pride. So these would all be part of a larger category of positive feelings or positive emotions. And perhaps joy is somewhere either at the core or maybe at the top of a pyramid of positive emotions, just because it can be so intense and so meaningful that it exists in arising with respect to a relationship with someone or something outside of ourselves. There's something about it that people sense is different than feeling happy. When I ask people, what is joy to you, or how would you differentiate between joy and happiness? Some people don't, but many people do. And I think one of the differences they say is that joy goes deeper. One friend of mine said that happiness is an inch deep and a mile wide, whereas joy is a mile deep and a mile wide. And I like that.
So if joy is this type of happiness, this kind of highest form of positive emotion, and has to do fundamentally with relatedness. You say in your paper for the consultation today, not necessarily spiritual transcendence, but some sort of transcendence of the self, going beyond the self. How is it then that we cultivate joy?
Cultivating joy, I think, requires a different formula than cultivating happiness, because they are fundamentally different. Happiness being depending upon circumstances and happenings. We kind of have to wait for a situation to arise in which we can feel happy. Whereas joy is something that we can recognize, quite independent of circumstances. So I used to think that, becoming more joyful required going out and getting something I did not have, right? Instead of realizing that, no, we already have all that we need to be joyful. And so one of the best practices for developing joy or finding joy is practicing gratitude. So that's been my area of interest and study for the last decade and a half, really. What gratitude is, why it matters, and how to get more of it. And I think it's not a surprise that there's a strong connection between gratefulness and joyfulness. That gratitude is one of the best routes for developing joy. When a person cultivates a sense of appreciation, a sense of wonder, a sense of aliveness and vitality, it seems to be a very reliable way of developing more joy, because gratitude is all about the other as well. Gratitude is the relationship strengthening emotion. So we don't feel grateful to ourselves, right? Right? We feel grateful in response to some gift we've received, whether it's a benefit from another human being, whether it's the perception of receiving grace from God. That sets the stage for the perception of gratefulness. I think gratefulness has two qualities that link it to joy. One is that it involves a celebration. So in response to gratitude, we celebrate the goodness we've received. We magnify or amplify that goodness. So I think that's an important quality of gratitude. And another one is that gratitude also recognizes the possibility of suffering or loss. That is, when we have experienced a loss or suffering, we often become more grateful. Gratitude often is deepened or intensified by that loss, by that suffering. We also become more grateful when we realize the good that we have, we might not have it for very long, that there's a scarcity or a limited time that we can experience the good. So gratitude involves celebration and suffering, much like joy does. I think that really helps differentiate it from happiness, which really doesn't involve those two elements. It might involve celebration, but certainly not the perception of suffering, the possibility that some sort of redemptive twist can occur in the face of something that is, on the face, seemingly very devastating.
So you distinguish in your paper between feeling grateful and being grateful. Would we want to make a similar distinction between feeling happy and being joyful or something
I think
like
that's
that?
a very good distinction. We could apply it to joy as well. We think of joy as an emotion. And certainly, the experts, worldwide experts on the study of emotion have identified joy as one of the basic fundamental emotions that you could see universally, or at least cross-culturally recurring. So it's a feeling state that exists with respect to a relationship or connection with something outside of ourselves, as I said earlier. But one can also have an attitude of joyfulness, which says, despite what's happening in my life, I'm going to choose to be joyful. When you think about the Apostle Paul writing the letter to the Philippians, where he uses the word joy, rejoicing 16 times in that letter. I mean, where is he when he's writing that letter? Right? He's in prison, right? He's awaiting a trial that could result in his death, and he's joyful nevertheless. Right? So it's almost a spirit of defiant joyfulness, which is really a chosen attitude, because you're not going to feel joy in that situation, but you can choose to adopt that as an attitude to help you, I think, really transcend that circumstance.
Yeah, and in fact, Paul can, in that letter, as often happens in the Bible, Paul can command joy, which if it were purely a feeling or emotion would feel manipulative or impossible or something.
That's right, and it's an encouragement to us in similar, not quite in similar circumstances, because we're not going to be in that situation, but to choose joy despite the immediacy of our situation.
Yeah, and indeed, Willie Jennings a couple weeks ago from Duke was talking about oppositional joy and saying that kind of, you talked about joy as an act of defiance, that joy can actually be a decision kind of contra mundi, right, against the state of the world, very much unlike happiness, where happiness is because of the world. It can be even a political act in that sense, a kind of act of resistance to what's wrong in the world.
Yes. And very inspirational, because we need exemplars, we need role models who can show us, how to live a good life. Right? We can know all the formula and know all the steps and tips and strategies about becoming happier, becoming more joyful, becoming more grateful. And there's no end of the advice that's out there. Right, happiness in 7 easy steps, or 3 hours, or 30 days, or 10 secrets, and we can know all this stuff, right? But we don't always apply all that stuff when it comes to living a good life. We need those role models out there, those exemplars, those teachers who can show us the way.
So, one strategy for finding happiness, if not joy, that's certainly on offer these days, is the market. Go buy what you need, or acquire more wealth, and wealth will make you happy. There's been some studies recently, but as comes through in your paper a bit, it feels like every day, and I'm a layman in this, but every day it feels like I open up the paper and find another article about the relationship between money and happiness. One day it's money actually does make you happy, another day it's no, money doesn't make you happy at all. What is it? Tell me the answer.
Obviously, there's no one answer, and it really depends. As so many questions, the answer is that it does depend upon various definitions, various ways of measuring, who you're looking at. Just as one illustration, the way money is used, for example, one of the very popular topics now is looking at what people spend their money on, what choices they make, economic decisions. Do you choose to buy something, an entity, an object, for example? How much joy does that bring you versus an experience? Let's say. So the researchers will distinguish between people who spent a certain amount of money, the same amount of money, so they equate for actual funds. But then do you spend that, let's say, on the new 65-inch 4K HD TV, or do you spend that money on a family vacation, which creates lasting memories and so on. Right? So it's the equivalent amount of money spent. Which one results in the longest, deepest, sustainable happiness? And typically they find, as most people would guess, it's the experience rather than the object per se that leads to happiness. So it's not spending per se, but it's how you spend it. And also other studies have shown that spending money on others brings much more happiness than spending it on ourselves. So that's another illustration that there's nuances, ways of looking at the link between income and happiness. And the earliest studies said that the correlation really depended upon people's actual absolute level of income. So once you get above a certain threshold, right, once you have enough money to meet your requirements, pay bills, to live comfortably, then additional increments in income don't contribute significantly to a person's level of happiness. So those are just some of the distinctions to be made.
Mm-hmm. Does it also have to do with one's kind of posture towards one's wealth? Joy seems to be about a kind of posture to the world, receiving it with gratefulness. How does a posture of materialism impact our joy in terms of the way that our money impacts our happiness?
Yeah, that's another great distinction. I think that's very important because, the attitude we hold toward our resources, whether we see ourselves as stewards of those resources to invest them wisely in something that will matter, that will transcend us, either right now in life or later on. I think that's more important than if we see it as kind of a sense of personal ownership. Right? Are these resources that we've been given, granted, that we can do something good with them, versus seeing as something that we have to keep to ourselves. Right? So the same amount of funds could be used in a lot of different ways. So it's the attitude underlying those that will link it to joy. And whether we receive it, we feel that we didn't necessarily deserve, we feel we've been recipient of good fortune, we've been benefited. People deal with that a lot differently than if they feel they're entitled to it. So the attitude of entitlement seems to be a critical one for linking, again, gratitude with joy and this whole posture of receiving, giving back the goodness that we've received.
And I understand this is my impression is that this is a kind of counter voice to some of what you just said, but I found it intriguing. You mentioned in your paper that despite all that we've said about about materialism, that actually materialist folks may have one leg up, which is that they're more likely to buy luxury goods. Can you explain how this works actually? Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of studies showing that when you invest in something that is considered to be, more valuable, you just are more likely to protect it. It gives you a different sense of identity. You see yourself as someone who can, afford the best things in life. And that may seem, again, kind of counterintuitive because it goes against so much other research which says that if you place your identity in the things that you accumulate, that's going to detract from your well-being. So I think it's probably a result of a broader worldview and perspective that says, yes, I've been given these resources, I can invest them in these various aspects of my life, but these are not going to totally define who I am. Right? I think it's more of a compartmentalization, it's not equating those with the sum total of who one is.
So then joy fundamentally has to do with this about relationship and how you understand yourself and how you relate to the world beyond you, including to people, to things, to what one acquires.
I think of joy as involving really, I think, the combination, to make it very succinct, of happiness plus gratitude. Okay? So the famous British writer G.K. Chesterton, about a century ago, he said that he wrote a lot about gratitude. That was his ethic, how he lived his life, prevailing aura of thankfulness. He said that gratitude is happiness doubled by wonder. happiness doubled by wonder. And I think you could say a very similar thing about joy. I think joy is happiness doubled by gratitude. The gratitude gives us that connection, it gives us that sense of transcendence, that sense of celebration, but also the awareness of the finiteness of life, the possibility of loss, of scarcity, of suffering, which adds to the value of the good that we take in.
Excellent. Well, Professor Emmons, thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to
Matt.
more conversation.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you.